I think, though, the question from for our perspective is, when we look at the firm stripped of externalities, and the Roman grain trade case gives us the opportunity to look at the firm stripped of many of its externalities. And we then take that understanding of the firm and we go back now and look at the forced rank distribution scheme. Does it invite us to consider it in a different way? So we looked at it from the top down and we've seen all these advantages and we said, okay, this looks like it should create optimal firm outcomes and it's a good thing to do. And if it creates a few unhappy employees, they can find jobs elsewhere. But if we look at it from the sides, in other words, once we come to it from a kind of firm logic that's informed by our Roman grain trade, does it encourage us to ask a different kind of question? And I'm going to suggest to you that it does. I'm going to suggest to you that it asks us to consider a very fundamental question, and a question that I suspect is not asked enough of these schemes. If you are operating in an environment where every quarter or every year or even every half year or every project, 2 people are flagged for promotion, 6 people are told they're doing fine, and 2 people are, in the nicest possible way, encouraged perhaps to seek other employment options. Where, as an employee working under that system, where does your primary incentive lie? What is your first and foremost incentive under a scheme like that? What are you primarily seeking to achieve under that kind of a scheme?
Not to get fired.
Not to get fired.
Be promoted.
Be promoted. Those are the 2 choices, aren't they? Be promoted or not get fired. And so the question is, under a scheme, in the aggregate, I mean, we must always account for the glorious diversity of humanity itself, and so there will always be exceptions. But in the aggregate, for an employee base of, say, 50 or 100,000 people or whatever it is, where would we expect the primary incentive in the aggregate to be located? To seek promotion or to avoid being fired, to avoid termination?
Your incentives are always going to be selfish. They're not going to be the same as the firm's incentives.
Economics teaches us that we are inherently selfish beings, only looking out for us. That's true.
The idea of the scheme is for you to achieve, or for the firm to have its employees achieve what the firm wants.
That's true.
But in the end, whatever the employee is going to do is for himself.
So where is their primary incentive? And the suggestion is their primary incentive is not to be fired. Does that make sense? Do we agree? Is there consensus in the room that under a scheme like that, in the aggregate, the primary incentive of the employee is to first and foremost avoid being terminated? In other words, once they've fulfilled that condition, then their next incentive presumably is to go up, to secure their bonus, to get promoted to the next rank and so on. But the necessary precondition for that is not to get fired, right? If we agree that that's the case, and I think there's overwhelming consensus in the room that that is indeed the case, what does it do then in terms of firm outcomes, a scheme like this? What does a scheme like this do in terms of firm outcomes? And I want to consider that for a moment. Let's first then ask the question, why is it that the employee is primarily motivated to avoid being terminated? I mean, the suggestion was, some jobs are not for you. And isn't it nice to know that by being given a really crappy evaluation and invited in the nicest possible way to look for alternatives in life, right? Why shouldn't we embrace that? Why shouldn't we embrace this kind of information about ourselves? I tried banking, it wasn't for me, now I'm in baking. See what I did there? So, why would it be that the employee is primarily incentivized to avoid being fired under a scheme like that? What's the element that's entailed by that scheme?
Change.
Change. People hate change. I have a nice office at the bank. I don't want to have to go and take my stuff out and move down the street to another firm. Okay, change.
It also somewhat makes you look bad in terms of performance. So if you're obviously performing below the standard, then you get fired. That's somewhat the image then.
It actually attaches to you a signal, doesn't it? If you have to go out and get a job as a result of having been encouraged to do so by your former employee, you're actually carrying that into the marketplace. It actually diminishes your own human capital. It actually reduces your market value. In other words, it entails reputational risk, does it not? A scheme like that. I was working at a firm, and as a result of the evaluation of my abilities, my knowledge, my capacities at that firm, I am no longer working at that firm. What does the market take away from that? By the way, I'd like a job with you. Sure, you have a proven track record of incompetence. We'd love to offer you the corner office. It entails a great deal of reputational risk, does it not? If you end up part of that bottom two, you then are carrying with you a signal into the marketplace that has potentially real effects on your own human capital. Which means, and it follows the model of what economics predicts our behavior to be, your primary incentive is to avoid attaching that kind of risk to yourself. You're going to avoid taking on that kind of risk, which means you're going to avoid trying to be part of that bottom two, to avoid that negative signal, to avoid the diminution of your human capital. Hence, the primary motivation will be not to get fired. Please don't terminate me this quarter. I really don't want to have to go get another job. What does that do for the outcome of the firm? In a scheme like this, in which people's primary incentive is not to be terminated, what would we predict would be the consequences for the firm?
I haven't been past something like this, but I imagine it makes people choose sort of make low-risk decisions.
Critical. Isn't that critical, right? Does a scheme like this encourage risk-taking? No. In fact, it systematically and structurally disincentivizes the taking of risk. Why? Because taking risk is inherently risky. It enhances your chances of being part of that too, right? You're like, I'm going to try doing something a little bit different this project. Didn't work out. Sorry. 2 people have to go. You're part of that too. So it structurally discourages the taking of risk. What else does it do? It diminishes team spirit. Yes. Are you more or less likely to collaborate in an environment like that? Less likely to collaborate. If your primary motivation is to secure your own security, in other words, to avoid being part of that bottom two, one of the strategies that you can adopt in order to secure that outcome is to not collaborate, i.e. help, other potential candidates who are part of that bottom two. Because it's a zero-sum game. If you're not part of that group that's let go, that means somebody else is. And if that happens to be Bob, a few doors down, better him than me. So why would you help him? It diminishes, it attaches potential risk to you. So you would expect systematic discouragement of collaboration. What else?
You might also reduce the level of output as a company as a whole, because everyone's just working to be better than the two and no better than that, because not that many people are getting promoted, so what's the point? Why waste my time? Another excellent point, right? If the evaluation is purely relative, what you're going to do is benchmark your performance to that relative standard, not some absolute standard of excellence. Which means once you've done what you need to do in order to avoid being part of that bottom two, and you don't think it's very likely that you're going to be moving up, how likely are you then to do something on top of that? Do we think that a scheme like this might promote strategies not just to enhance your own position, but to enhance your own position by pushing other people down, right? Like, for example, the day of that big presentation to the important client, and somebody locks Nadine in the bathroom so she can't be there. And there's like, where's Nadine? And she's like, please let me out. And they're like, she just wasn't carrying her weight on the project, right? Do you think something like that might happen? I mean, that's an exaggerated example, of course. No one's going to lock you in the bathroom. But do we see that kind of potential? Those of you who've worked under this scheme, did you see things like that? Yeah? The last question you might ask is, what about talent clustering within a firm? Right? One of the things that firms want to encourage is that good people organically come together to produce good results. What would we expect to see from the point of view of talent clustering in a firm that has a forced rank distribution scheme, a rank and yank?
I think they actually do get together. They need information. It's the most important thing in a firm. So they get together, but they don't trust each other.
They get together, but it's fully characterized by mistrust and suspicion.
One of the best tips of advice I got from a manager in my firm was keep your friends close, but your enemies closer, because you need the information they have.
You were working in a firm where somebody who was good heavens. Let me get this straight. You took a job where the first piece of advice you got was Keep your friends close, but keep your enemies closer? Was that a good working environment? What was the canteen environment like? Did you have checking for whether your food had been poisoned or something? I mean, were there metal detectors at the doors? Did employees tend to disappear under suspicious circumstances? Bob hasn't shown up to work for a few weeks. Good heavens. Okay, well, I mean, I think the point about talent clustering is pretty clear, which is that if you're on a group, or if you're on a team, sorry, of 10 people, and they're the 10 smartest people in your firm, in your division, say, and you're under one of these schemes, what are you going to be thinking when you find out that these are the 9 other people? Are you going to be saying, great, what a great opportunity for me to learn from them, really going to benefit from all the knowledge that they have, it's going to really give you an opportunity to grow? Is that what you're thinking? No, you're thinking, damn, I got to compete with these people, right? Like, this is going to be really rough. Whereas, if you end up on a team with 9 nicely mediocre people like yourself, you're thinking, okay, dodged a bullet this quarter. You know, it's just going to be too hard. I think I'll be able to make it through. I mean, who knows? As I say, in the individual instance, we have to account for difference. But in the aggregate, we would predict that a scheme that inherently and necessarily introduces punitive measures would discourage talent clustering, because it would make essentially the fulfillment of that primary incentive, that primary obligation, harder. And so if it makes it harder, you would avoid it. If it's harder to avoid being fired by working under a condition A or a condition B, you're going to avoid it. And that means then that we would predict systematic avoidance of talent clustering in a firm.